Seen from this administration so far, admitting their mistakes and then slowing down to make sure it doesn't happen again, not likely. So let's dig in a bit deeper, look a bit closer to exactly what's being said here. Because the White House was very clear today, saying that Garcia is not just a gang member, but a leader of MS-13. And even more, involved in human trafficking. Damning allegations. But where's the evidence? Not only is there not any evidence being shown here, but the information that we do have appears to contradict these claims. According to court records, Garcia, the son of a former police officer in El Salvador, has no criminal record in the U.S. or El Salvador. No criminal record. Now, that's pretty hard to do if you're a gang member or a leader of a gang member. When he was 16 years old, he crossed the border illegally. Why? Because a violent gang was trying to recruit him, so he fled to the U.S. He crossed the border illegally, and he began working in construction. As Chris mentioned, in 2019, he was detained along with others as they were looking for work at Home Depot. And a confidential informant alleged that Garcia was a member of the MS-13 gang, just like the White House alleged again today. However, back in 2019, there was a deportation hearing, a hearing before a judge who listened to testimony and looked at evidence. And after hearing all the evidence, this judge found that it was Garcia that was credible, not the confidential informant. It was actually Garcia who was at risk of gang violence, that for years gang members had tried to extort money from Garcia's mother's business. The gang members had tried to recruit first Garcia's older brother and then Garcia. In the end, the judge ruled that it was clear that Garcia would be in danger from the Barrio 13 gang if he was forced to return to El Salvador. So the judge put him under a withholding of removal order. The judge pointed out that he couldn't give him asylum because Garcia had failed to apply for it within that first year that he had entered the U.S., back when he was 16 years old. But he did impose the withholding of removal order to make sure that Garcia was protected. 6 years later, Garcia is now married to a U.S. citizen. He has 2 stepchildren and a son, all of whom have disabilities. He is a sheet metal apprentice working on a journeyman's license at the University of Maryland. And on March 12th, he was pulled over by ICE agents as he was driving home with his son. He was informed that his immigration status had changed, and he was put into handcuffs. But was that true? Did his immigration status actually change? Joining us now to dive into the legal aspects of this is Deron Smallcomb. He is an immigration attorney, and he's the author of Securing America's Future, a blueprint for 21st century immigration reform. So Deron, Abrego-Garcia had been given this withholding of removal status by a judge. What protections did that actually give him?
Well, that gives him some protection, at least temporarily, from being returned to his home country, which in this case is El Salvador, where he was returned. It can be changed or modified if conditions change in the future. Now, withholding of removal is one step down from asylum. So if you claim asylum when you enter or at the port of entry, then you have a path that will ultimately lead to citizenship if granted. However, withholding of removal does not. It is a temporary protection to if you are going to be harmed or tortured if returned to your home country, which they believe that he would be.
Mm-hmm. That sounds very serious. Now, you said that it could be changed if there were new conditions. How exactly? What's the process to do that?
Well, generally, it would be before an immigration court. You would go before a judge, ICE would, and ask, or Homeland Security, and ask for them to reconsider the order because conditions on the ground had changed. So in this case with El Salvador, about 10 years ago until 4 or 5 years ago, a common argument that attorneys would put forward to get withholding of removal would be that their client had tattoos, could be mistaken for gang tattoos, and either they would be imprisoned by the government or killed by other gangs. This was kind of the El Salvador defense for a long time. But a few years back, Nayib Bukele became president of El Salvador, and things changed quite a bit. It went from one of the most dangerous countries on the planet to one of the least dangerous countries on the planet over the past few years. And so one could argue that these conditions have changed.
And if the conditions have changed, what's the process then for that actually to change the status of the person?
Typically, Homeland Security would go to an immigration court and ask them to reopen and reconsider the case based on this new evidence. That's normally how it would go. However, in this case, it was a little bit different. See, the Trump administration has invoked the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, and that gives the president broad authority to deport people that are considered enemies or that are invading the United States. So here the question is really, does immigration court have the jurisdiction in this case, or does the administration have the latitude to just deport?
Go ahead.
Please.
Yeah, as we know, that's still a question that's being decided in a court right now that has been up and arguing back and forth. So we're waiting to find out the ruling there. But here the White House is saying, you know, as Chris said, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. Those words might be a catchy tune, but it really doesn't seem to apply here because, first of all, you don't have to go home, but they just sent him there against his will in handcuffs. And secondly, if the U.S. decides they do want to deport him, as you were saying, under this removal order, there is a procedure that they could have followed to do that, going back into court. But as far as we know, they didn't do that. He was just taken. So a couple of weeks ago, the president said this when he was asked about the criminal records of these men. Listen here, Deron.
Well, I was told that they went through a very strong vetting process and that that will also be continuing in El Salvador. And if there's anything like that, we would certainly want to find out. And but we will continue that process, absolutely. We don't want to make that kind of a mistake.
So, Deron, now we know that the White House does admit they made a mistake. How do we know there aren't more mistakes being made?
Well, there might be. And so to look at how they're going to process people under this Alien Enemies Act, you have to go back to the last time it was invoked, which was in World War II. And back then they would do administrative hearings before they would remove somebody from the country. So it wasn't a full judicial hearing, but at least the person got to speak on their behalf. And then administratively, they could decide whether that person would be deported or not. And so they haven't done that. My guess is that they will go back to doing that for the future. But ultimately, I think that they're trying to make a point here, is that they're going to deport. They want to put fear in people that are here illegally and that are affiliated with gangs to get them to self-deport rather than being sent to El Salvador. Now, again, I think there's some jurisdictional issues here. Hopefully, El Salvador will review the case, because if not, what will happen is an immigration attorney, for example, would say, well, the conditions may have changed in El Salvador. They may be safe now. However, he's being sent back and put in prison without a hearing. Therefore, the conditions are still poor for people in his category, and there should be some review before the actual deportation.
Yeah, I think the review is the key here that we've been missing, is the review process being followed. Deron, I have just one quick question here. We're almost out of time, but people are asking this question. You know, the U.S. is saying they don't have any jurisdiction. They can't really do anything to help him now that he's in El Salvador. But the U.S. is also paying the government of El Salvador $6 million annually to house these men in these prisons. Wouldn't that give the U.S. some say in what happens to them there?
Sure, they'd have some say, but maybe not jurisdiction. We're kind of splitting hairs on that one a little bit. Certainly, if Trump says send the guy back, well, Kelly's going to send him back. But at the same time, he is under the custody of a foreign government of which he is a citizen, and not in the United States, in which he has no legal status other than a protection order from removal.
All right. Y'all, it'll be interesting to see what happens going forward. Deron Smallcomb, thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us.